Lecture 9: Relevance Theory and Translation. Relevance theory is associated with pragmatics, which is primarily concerned with how language is used in communication, particularly with the way meaning is conveyed and manipulated by the participants in a communicative situation. In other words, pragmatics deals with speaker's meaning and the way it is interpreted by the hearer, in what is known as implicature. In translation, implicature can be seen as one kind or level of equivalence between a source text and a target text, which can be established. The theory, according to Gott, is developed by Sperber and Wilson, who emphasize the interpretive use of language as distinct from the descriptive use. The former use is explicated by Gott as follows. The fundamental characteristic of the interpretive use of language is not just the fact that two utterances interpretively resemble one another, but that one of them is intended to be relevant in virtue of its resemblance with the other utterance. In general terms, in reported speech, interpretively used utterances achieve relevance by informing the hearer of the fact that so-and-so has said something or thinks something. So, God tries to describe translation in terms of a general theory of human communication based on the premise that the ability of human beings to infer what is meant may be accounted for in terms of observing the principle of relevance defined as achieving maximum benefit at minimum processing cost. In other words, relevance theory endeavors to give an explicit account of how the information processing faculties of the mind enable us to communicate with one another. Its domain is therefore mental faculties rather than texts or processes of text production. The theory then represents a shift from description to explanation. Relevance theory is not a descriptive classificatory approach. It does not try to give an orderly description of complex phenomena by grouping them into classes, but tries instead to understand the complexities of communication in terms of cause-effect relationship. Towards a comprehensive applicable theory of translation, it is perhaps a very arduous task to formulate a comprehensive applicable theory amidst multiplicity, miscellany, and disparity of the existing theories. Nevertheless, we try tentatively to furnish such a theory, depending particularly on some authentic references. First comes Webster's definition of the theory as a body of generalizations and principles in association with the practice in a field of activity. Manifestly, translation is intrinsically a practical activity from which generalizations can be inferred, and is in a dire need for principles to guide the practice. Generalizations are only inferences drawn from paradigms, instances of facts provided by contrastive analyses of various levels in both source text and the target text. These levels are morphological level, the syntactic level, textual and stylistic rhetorical level. When generalizations are universally applicable and predictable, they become principles, norms, rules, or laws to govern the translation activity. In the same vein, Graham asserts that any substantial theory of translation assumes some formal inquiry concerning the general principles which define an object and specify a method of study. Furthermore, Rigorous theory of translation would also include a practical evaluation procedure. So, any theory, including one on translation, should contain the following. First, the statement of its basis. Second, the description of its object. Third, an inventory of rules and the like. So, a theory of translation should contend that translation theory main concern is determine appropriate translation methods and to provide a framework of principles, restricted rules and hints for translating texts and criticizing translations. On the same lines, an applied linguist such as Longman defines theory as a statement of a general principle based upon reasoned argument and supported by evidence that is intended to explain a particular fact, event, or phenomena. So a theory is an explanation of a phenomena or a phenomenon, the perception of system and order in something observed. From the observation, data is collected to explain the theory, which, according to Bell, will lead to a model. Ideally, a theory must reflect four main characteristics. 1. Empiricism. It must be testable. 2. Determinism. It must be able to predict. 3. Parsimony. It must be simple and economic. 4. Generality. It must be comprehensive. A full, inclusive theory of translation must accommodate many elements which can serve to explain and predict all phenomena, falling within the domain of translation as a process and translation as a product, to the exclusion of all phenomena falling outside it. But instead of one theory which caters for both process and product, there are three types of theories of translation. 1. A theory of translation as a process. A theory of translating. This would require a study of information processing and, within that, such topics as perception, memory, and the encoding and decoding of messages, and would draw heavily on psychology and psycholinguistics. 2. A theory of translation as a product. A theory of translated texts. This would require a study of text not merely by means of the traditional levels of linguistic analysis, like syntax and semantics, but also making use of stylistics and recent advances in text linguistics and discourse analysis. 3. A theory of translation, both process and product. A theory of translating and translation. This would require an integrated study of both, and such a general theory is, presumably, the long-term goal for translation studies. This third type, process and product, we should add an essential intermediary element between the process and the product, like transfer. Accordingly, translation is a three-phase activity. In fact, the intricate nature of translation makes it reasonable to relate the product to the three-phase process, though the constituent phases are not autonomously separate from each other. So first comes the phase of decoding, whereby the original text is analyzed for a thorough acquaintance both thematically and stylistically, that is, for full comprehension and stylistic appreciation. Here, the translator performs the triple task of a reader, a critic, and an interpreter. He has not only to comprehend the semantic units of the original text, but also to be aware of the author's style and salient syntactic rhetorical features when dealing with a literary text. The initial step in the textual analysis carried out conventionally and perhaps subconsciously by most translators is to segment the text into a number of units: words, phrases, clauses, and sentences, within each of which this distribution of denotative and connotative meanings are scanned. A pertinent test of intelligibility is purported by a famous translator and a scholar in this field, Nida. In his closed technique, the reader is provided with a text in which, for example, every fifth word is deleted, and he is asked to fill in with whatever words that seem to fit the context best. The degree of comprehensibility is related to the degree of predictability. It is assumed that the easier it is for the reader to guess the next word in a sentence, the easier to comprehend the word in the given context, and the greater the number of correct guesses, the greater the predictability, and consequently the easier the text. The second phase is that of transcoding or transfer. After acquainting himself with the original text, the translator usually starts to ascertain and record the equivalence in the target language for each of the elements he has already identified. In most cases, however, equivalence is far from being identical, or, as Catford puts it, nearly always approximate, since every language is ultimately, not identical with any other language. Items are said to be equivalent in the two languages when they are interchangeable in a given situation. Lexically, equivalence appears to rest on the principle of bilingual synonymy. The notion that words are mere labels of real things goes back as far as Plato and carries over to some extent into de Saussure's concept of the sign. In such a simplified view, translation consists of exchanging labels, consulting, if need be, a dictionary or informant, and it underlies awkward literal or word-for-word transfer and what Dryden terms metaphrase. Such a view has been recently questioned by many linguists and celebrated translators for true synonymy, the property of words to be mutually interchangeable in two contexts is quite rare for most abstract items, let alone the highly emotive and connotative, the language-specific and culture-specific ones. In consequence, the translator cannot easily or immediately furnish solutions to all problems regarding equivalence, albeit resorting to an exhaustive search through all available reference materials. If an equivalent expression cannot be located, he must find some parallel expression that will yield approximately the same kind of effect produced by the original. Idioms and figures of speech, such as allegory, metaphor, parable, or simile are cases in point. The metaphor bayda in Arabic, white, which is translated white in English, cannot be rendered as such, white night, but layali bayda in the Arabic expression layali bayda, so which means sleepless night or nights. Similarly, the word teeth becomes arm in Arabic in the following idiomatic utterance: he would have given his back teeth for such a chance. Once we translate it into Arabic, we have to put an parallel. We have to transfer the parallel effect that is caused by the original text or original utterance. مستعد للتضحية حتى بذراعه في سبيل ذلك. The third and final phase is recoding the transferred message in the target language, complying with its linguistic as well as literary conventions of the literary text, so as to be as semantically accurate and aesthetically effective as the original. A translation of a literary work of art can justify itself only when it comes to be a literary work, occupying an appropriate position in the target literature comparable to the status of the original in the source literature, and at the same time resembling the original in every respect. A proper literary translation does not simply convey to us the elements of the original in such fullness as may be, but conveys them to us in something of the same order and structure of relatedness as the original. If the product sounds awkward, in other words, if it reads as the original and not an original, the translator has not gone far enough in fulfilling his function. That is, his product is lacking aesthetic values. As it has failed to transmit the literariness and felicity of the original. The ideas may have been accurately reproduced, but aesthetically wanting. On the other hand, he will have gone too far should his translation depart too radically from the semantic content and or literary values of the original. This very delicate yet difficult question intensifies the plight of the literary translator, for his recreation of the original should not render translation as a mere imitation or an artistically embellished edition. Besides his literary and rhetorical competence, he has to be very tactful and eclectic in his approach. For instance, of the three methods of translation which Dryden distinguishes in his preface to the translation of Ovid's epistles, meta phrase or word for word might shackle the translator to the original work, whereas paraphrase or sense for sense and imitation, whereby he abandons the text of the original, both bestow upon him and freedom which would necessarily distance him from the original. Therefore, one may well concur with Adams, who asserts that literary works are harder to translate than they were to compose. For the original composition is the art of choosing the exactly right word or expression, and includes and includes the option of changing and modification as deemed appropriate, whereas the art of translation is the art of choosing among a set of possible compromises. It simply does not allow that important option. Thank you very much, dear students, and I will deliver the lecture 10 next Tuesday, inshallah. So till then, be safe, stay at home, and take care. Bye-bye. Therefore, something needs to be said about the notion of context as understood in relevance theory. In relevance theory, the notion of context of an utterance is a psychological construct, a subset of the hearer's assumptions about the world. More specifically, it is the set of premises used in interpreting that utterance. Under this definition, context is a very wide notion that can include virtually any phenomenon entertainable by the human mind. A context in this sense is not limited to information about the immediate physical environment or the immediately preceding utterances. Expectations about the future, scientific hypotheses or religious beliefs, general cultural assumptions, beliefs about the mental state of the speaker may all play a role in interpretation. Note that this notion of context also includes the text surrounding an utterance, what has sometimes been called the co-text. There is some other important point to be mentioned here. That characteristic of context in relevance theory is that it is assumed to be organized, and that this organization affects the accessibility of a particular piece of contextual information on a particular occasion. For example, having just talked about childhood memories, information about some of your toys may be very easily accessible. On another occasion, though, it might take considerable effort to remember the color of your first big toy truck. Thus, there is a correlation between the accessibility of information in our minds and the effort required to recall it. With this clarification about context, we now return to the question of how it is possible for hearers to find and use the contextual information which the speaker intended them to use and which is necessary for understanding her correctly. Let's take optimal relevance as an example. According to Sperber and Wilson, the central factor that makes communication succeed in the pursuit of optimal relevance on the part of both the communicator and the addressee. An utterance is optimally relevant when it enables the audience to find without unnecessary effort the meaning intended by the communicator, and B, when that intended meaning is worth the audience's effort, that is, when it provides adequate benefits to the audience. These benefits are psychological in nature. They consist in modifications of a person's knowledge and are referred to technically as positive contextual effects. The function of optimal relevance in communication is captured in the principle of relevance, which is believed to be an innate constraint in our human psychological makeup. According to this principle, whenever a person sets out to communicate something, she automatically communicates the presumption that what she is going to say is believed to be optimally relevant to the audience. In this claim to optimal relevance, which guides the recipient in identifying the speaker intending context for a given utterance in the following way, it makes him expect that the contextual information needed for the correct interpretation is readily accessible. Hence, he begins the interpretation process from information most readily available to him at that time. Furthermore, he will assume that when combined with the right context, the utterance will yield an interpretation that is worth the effort invested in processing it. On these assumptions, the recipient will proceed with the interpretation process until he arrives at an interpretation that fulfills both conditions. It is derivable without an unnecessary effort and yields adequate contextual effects. In other words, the claim to optimal relevance leads the hearer to accept the first interpretation consistent with the principle of relevance as the right, that is, the speaker intended interpretation. Thus, the search for optimal relevance guides the hearer not only to the speaker intended context but also to the speaker intended interpretation. It should be added here that people are not usually aware of these interpretation processes in their minds. They take place subconsciously. Talking about the interpretive and descriptive use of language, one of the important claims of relevance theory is that there are two psychologically distinct modes of using language: the descriptive use and the interpretive use. Since these two terms are not necessarily self-explanatory, they are now briefly introduced. A language utterance is said to be used descriptively when it is intended to be taken as true of a state of affairs in some possible world. An utterance is said to be used interpretively when it is intended to represent what someone said or thought. The crucial factor in interpretive use is that there be a relationship of interpretive resemblance between the original utterance and that used to represent it. Such interpretive resemblance between utterances consists in the sharing of explicatures and implicatures. This implies that resemblance is a matter of degree. Thus, two utterances interpretively resemble each other more closely. The more explicatures or implicatures they share, as an example shown earlier, which shows that the highest degree of resemblance to the original, it shares all explicatures and implicatures of the original, though only under one important condition, to which we shall return at the end of the lecture. That is, the direct quotation is interpreted in the same context as the original. By contrast, excerpts, paraphrases, summarizes, etc. can be etc., can be a great deal as to the degree and kind of resemblance they show. Thus, if asked about the content of a particular lecture, the respondent or reporter would have a range of options open for her reply.